To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod.
Hey everyone, Artie here. And welcome to All Care for All People, a special limited series from Death Panel that we've been quietly working on in the past few months. Over the next few weeks, we're going to be presenting a series of interviews with people engaged in mutual aid survival programs, working across a variety of tactics, locations, and organizational structures, who are each stepping in different ways to provide care where it is needed, care where it is disallowed, where it is criminalized, and in the pockets of state abandonment on which our political economy thrives and in conditions that have become only more dire under the thumb of a second Trump administration. A few things about this series. First, this is an attempt to highlight the sheer proliferation of survival work and mutual aid projects happening right now, a series in the form of more or less oral histories intended to show not only just how much is happening, but how eminently possible and necessary it is to start doing this work, or something like it, wherever you are. But we also want to be clear that these interviews offer only the smallest glimpse of political activity happening right now. First, because we chose to focus on speaking with projects oriented around care work or health in a broad sense, like free clinics, harm reduction, street medics, and more. And second, because we've also focused on projects that already have some form of public presence. There's a lot of work happening out there that is happening very quietly by necessity, where added attention to the work being done would be antithetical to the perpetuation of those projects. That also extends to the subjects that we did interview. You'll notice that we've taken a lighter touch to the editing on these recordings. They're more straight oral history recordings than the typical Death Panel episode. They are edited, however. In each case, we've removed anything the organizers have requested us to keep off the record. You'll hear the occasional beep, for example, when proper nouns were used that had to be redacted, and in some cases, brief asides will be cut. Some of the interviews are with groups that will share their names. In other cases, interviews will obscure even the specific name and location of the group, and in some, the voices have been modulated to preserve anonymity. This is especially important in cases where the groups are targets of the state, even if what they're involved in on a day-to-day basis is as simple as keeping their neighbors fed. Many of you will also notice the title of the series shares its name with the book Beau and I are currently working on, also called All Care for All People. That's intentional, as in many ways this series serves as a precursor to the book that we're currently in the middle of writing. So this series also offers, in a very direct way, access to some of the background research for All Care for All People that we're currently working through. And we hope that to have these interviews available into the future will mean that these can have their own effects and their own impact independent of the book itself. As a final note, these will certainly be unlocked in the future in some form. For now, consider these to be early access for patrons while we're taking the time to work on the book. Having these in the patron feed is also going to allow us to more quickly address any information that might need to be additionally redacted at the request of organizers before these are fully public. With all that said, however, please, obviously, feel free to share these episodes, download and share them, with any friends who might need to hear them, or especially with people that you organize with. Because as a series of special episodes within Death Panel, and on the occasion of writing our book, All Care for All People, the best thing that these could possibly do is inspire or enrich more work like what we're trying to capture here, regardless of whether we're ready to release them out into the open internet yet or not. And for patrons listening to this, we want to, as ever, thank you for your support, not only in making this show possible, which you do, the show is entirely made possible by your support, but also thank you for supporting us in making a series like this. We've gotten so many requests over the years for something like this, really since the COVID and organizing episodes in 2023, and it's taken us a while to find the frame that would really make the series what we would want it to be as listeners ourselves. So, thank you. And I'm so excited for everyone to hear these and learn from comrades all over the next few weeks. And of course, we'll be back to our regular programming soon. With all that said, I'll leave it to Beau to set up this week's interview. More from us soon, and stay alive another week.
Okay, we're officially on the record now. Could each of you introduce yourselves and just start by telling us a little bit about, your connection to the work that we're talking about today, where you're coming from, into this conversation, and share anything about sort of how you approach this that you want listeners to know at the top.
Yeah, I'm Tina, and I've been involved with Lobelia Commons for since the beginning, since it was founded in 2020. And I am a part of the Earthbound Farmers Almanac Editorial Collective. I do a lot of design work, and I'm also a farmer and nursery person and agricultural researcher.
Hi, I'm Hadley. I use they, them pronouns, and I've also been a part of Lobelia Commons since 2020 when it started. And before that, kind of was getting into that work through being part of the climate movement and doing a lot of direct action organizing against pipelines and things like that. And alongside that work, kind of, in my own sort of balance between positive and negative organizing, like working for toward different sort of food autonomy projects. And I have somewhat a background in agriculture and farming, and have been basically planting food forests in different places in the South and Southeast for about 10 or 12 years now.
My name is Beau. My pronouns are they, them. I've been involved with the Editorial collective pretty much since the beginning. I've been doing illustration work, and I also am a farmer and nursery person and have been involved with food autonomy and organizing in the Gulf South for the last 5 years.
Thank you all so much for that. I'm really excited to get a chance to talk to you all about this project that I've learned so much from, and I'm so inspired by and grateful for. And it's also really cool to get to know the people responsible for like the visual identity, and some part responsible for the visual identity of the Almanac, which is beautiful. For those who haven't checked it out, we'll put a link to that, to the editions of it in the episode description as well, so you can check this out. But just to sort of start us off here, for listeners who are, maybe unfamiliar with this project, can you talk through like what Lobelia Commons is, and what's the Earthbound Farmers Almanac in your own words?
Yeah, so Lobelia Commons comes out of the early days of the pandemic. There was a number of mutual aid projects that were popping up in the autonomous scene in New Orleans. And one of which was called New Orleans Mutual Aid Group, primarily giving away groceries and doing these kind of like really direct services, driving and doing the whole completely masked up hazmat kind of like moving grocery boxes kind of work. And that project came out of some previous food autonomy organizing that was built around, it was like sort of a food share, which was built around existing resource streams with the port, that another group, Community Kitchen, which is still around today, is kind of a food not bombs type project, very important project in New Orleans. And that resource stream dried up because the ports all shut down. And so I remember going to the port and them not having anything but a bunch of like moldy oyster mushrooms. And so the NOMAG, the mutual aid group, was starting to just buy huge amounts of stuff from Costco. And there was also a surge in volunteers at the same time. And so those of us that started Lobelia kind of wanted to push it further and try and get out of the trap of Costco. And in like no shade on our friends who went on to do that work for years afterwards. I don't think they still exist anymore, but we saw this as an opportunity where there's all this volunteer energy. We were a little bit redundant in the space, and we wanted to open up a more imaginative way to address the question of food autonomy and trying to find a path towards neighborhood survival along with that food question. And so the project went on to start a number of gardens, some of which were squatted, some of which were formed with permission from people who just owned a lot and weren't doing anything with it. There was a number of classes that we put on, including mushroom cultivation, various like rainwater harvesting kind of workshops and that sort of thing. We eventually came to coming up with the Almanac as a idea that was kind of just spitballed around when we were just hanging out in a one of our gardens that we were working on at the time. And it was kind of this like joyful meeting where we're just kind of spitballing, and we saw that as a way of increasing the connective tissue between already existing efforts for food autonomy. We saw this as a possible way forward that wouldn't necessitate Lobelia Commons becoming this big activist organization, but more serving some of that connective tissue rather than, just trying to answer this huge question on our own.
Yeah, totally. And just to sort of add on to that description of Lobelia, especially during those first couple of years of the pandemic, it was never like a, super tightly organized, everybody's going to a big meeting together every week or every month or something like that. It was very sort of loose and diffuse in this way that was like pretty nice, actually, with like people just doing kind of a bunch of different things under this like broader, connective network of Lobelia or whatever. And, so there was like an herb sort of working group that was like harvesting herbs in wild places or on someone's property, and then setting up a pop-up tent like in a public place in the city, and like sharing herbal medicine with people walking by, and people in the mushroom group doing mushroom things. And so it was like a nice just kind of framework to almost even just give people permission to start a fun project and like see where it goes.
We have some words that our editorial collective had put together, and for the folks that aren't here, I thought it might be nice to read a bit of the back of the Almanac just to give people an idea of the spirit of it. So I can read that now, but this is a farmer's almanac for the end of a world and the beginning of many others. The evolving crises all around us and the attempts by the ultra-rich to flee the earth entirely make clear that none of the reigning institutions will make any effort towards our survival. But there are alternatives to the antics of hoarding preppers and consumerist gimmicks. As has always been so, reconsidering how we get our water, food, medicine will determine our ability to continually resist, subvert, and create. The way forward out of this mess will mean charting a new course informed with ancestral knowledges developed through generations of struggle against land theft, exploitation, and enslavement. We will have to work together, constructing and reconstructing the ability to sustain and care for each other. This almanac is for developing the necessary knowledge, infrastructure, and practices. The old farmer's almanac presented conventional wisdom. This almanac is a place for experimentation, finding new forms, and retrofitting old ones, for sharing stories of lived efforts towards a collective exit from this colonial nightmare, this separateness from the earth.
Thank you so much for reading that, Beau. I love the statement in the final page of the almanacs. I think it's really important that we were able to read it for listeners up at the top too. And I just really appreciate sort of hearing how things coalesced and came together. I wonder if we could talk in a little bit more detail about sort of the beginning, right? And like how things developed, what the different like components of Lobelia were, and sort of like you all talked briefly about all of these sort of different offerings that were happening simultaneously. But maybe we could sort of talk through in more detail, like some of those components and things that were happening, and also maybe go into a little more detail about sort of like the like intent behind them, the sort of framing and underlying sort of purpose and goals that you all sort of didn't have to set out with, but sort of came to in the process of doing the work?
Yeah, I think one example of kind of like a flow that the course of Lobelia has followed is from that mushroom group, of which I was a part of for a bit, and it kind of petered out at a point, but instead of just like petering out and becoming nothing, the energy from that project and those conversations became the seeds for an expansion of the ideas that were discussed there, which basically just like coming up with ways of getting in control of various resource streams that will fuel community food production, specifically like oyster mushrooms and shiitake mushrooms. And that group ended up becoming the seed to what is now Rocklow Farm. We ended up coming up with some land to expand what we already had been working on. And that feels really connected to some of the earliest goals that Lobelia was establishing, which was that we sought to break down the urban-rural divide a bit, in part because New Orleans is a walled city, basically. It's effectively an island by the floodwalls. And the food shed historically existed in like the lower Ninth Ward. There were these truck farms. But the weight of history of the 20th century running into Hurricane Katrina, there's now almost no farming comparatively to what was happening throughout much of the earlier 20th century. There's still some urban gardens and stuff like that, but not really industrial production at the scale required to feed a city. So there's been this knowledge that in the New Orleans food shed, going beyond the floodwalls and making connections in the rural is just necessary, especially in thinking through 2020, imagining the possibility of like New Orleans being a rebel city in a heightened kind of moment, like the George Floyd uprising. Would that happen? It's effectively a very siegeable city as well. And so this was like a practical step that we saw as like a long-term project to break down that divide, expand capacity, increase our ability to learn, where we're not kind of hemmed in by the constraints of renting houses, unstable housing. The New Orleans housing market is insane, as I'm sure it is pretty much everywhere. And so that was what fueled the creation of this kind of autonomous project that is also within the web of Lobelia. And we owe a great debt to the group in so-called Brazil, Terra dos Povos, which translates ish to like web of peoples, like a network kind of approach. And we saw our project kind of evolving out of this Lobelia moment into something that is maybe more fleshed out and more articulated.
Yeah, and unless you want to add something, Beau, about the Rocklow stuff, I could talk a little bit about the some of the other sort of early days of Lobelia stuff that we were working on at that time.
I can come back to it.
You sure?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, for my part, I, for example, wasn't part of that mushroom working group. And my big focus at that time was the kind of like nursery work and trying to like produce plants and share plants and like push toward a culture of people sharing plant starts with each other. So one of the things that we uh, started doing that I think was moderately successful during the first several months of the pandemic in 2020 was this thing called the decentralized nurseries. And so it was a little bit of a media campaign, or a little bit of a, like, you know, making flyers, making signs, and trying to make something really visible as an example and hoping people would sort of copy it. Just building off this idea of, you know, anybody who gardens is already sort of, you know, starting more peppers than they can plant, and they're sharing them with some friends or neighbors or something like that. And we tried to turn that into sort of like another iteration of like the little free library or the little free fridge that you see on the corner or something, and to have these little free nurseries, basically. So we had, thanks to Tina and other designers, like beautiful flyers that kind of explain the concept. And, you know, we spread those around and got a bunch of different people to put up these nurseries. And then, beyond that, like they were popping up, people were picking up the idea and like putting a bunch of plants on their front steps or whatever. I mean, for a little while before that, actually, we were even delivering plants to people, and that turned out to be ultimately not like the smartest way, the most sustainable way to distribute plants. But in the early months of the pandemic, when it like actually coincided with planting season, we had a phone number up around town where people could text or call, and somebody would drive to your house and drop off okra seedlings. And kind of similarly to what Tina was saying about this mushroom working group growing into this larger project that was like outside the city, but really like oriented toward the city and oriented toward like building these rural urban connections and stuff. The project I'm a part of is actually like a couple hours outside outside New Orleans. And it's called Bayou Food Forest. And it had been around for a few years at that point. Started in early 2019. And before that, it was a pipeline blockade camp that sort of, after the pipeline struggle ended, the land was owned by a nonprofit, and it was transitioned into sort of a positive project of trying to do regenerative agriculture education around growing and producing plants and stuff. And so our orientation has always been like, we are not just trying to, you know, grow food and distribute food, though we do try to do that. Our goals is to distribute plants and the skills and knowledge necessary for people to start their own food forests. And so we were pretty well positioned at that time to just direct a lot of the things we were producing out here, where obviously certain costs are much lower, even just the water, the price of water here compared to the municipal water in the city is much cheaper. And obviously we have a lot more space. We have 11 acres out here. And so we were producing fig trees, mulberry trees, sweet potato slips, all these different things. And especially during that first couple years of Lobelia, when there's a lot of energy. And I mean, maybe people have forgotten, or it takes a moment to remember, but, you know, there was like a real moment of like going to the grocery stores and certain things were not on the shelves. And suddenly there was this like veil had been pulled away, and like people in America started to think about where their food was coming from. And, you know, people are starting, you know, their pandemic garden or whatever. And so it worked really well for us to just be able to send all these trees into the city and know that there were people there who were excited to plant them in their yard or plant them out in neutral grounds. For folks who aren't familiar with New Orleans, there's tons of like two-way streets that are like divided by big grassy or treed like neutral grounds. Sometimes that's like the high ground where people park their cars when it's flooding and whatnot. But yeah, a lot of the trees that we started out here at our nursery ended up kind of guerrilla planted around the city. There's sort of one of those like little projects within Lobelia that still happens. It started in 2020, and it still kind of comes back to life at certain times of year and whatnot. Is the Front Yard Orchard initiative, where basically, you know, people go around, or sometimes we do it by flyers, and just offer free fruit trees to people, and often also help plant in people's yards. So that was a kind of thing that we were trying to do to sort of move a little bit beyond this community garden model that I think a lot of us are familiar with. And everybody knows of a community garden in their neighborhood that you always walk by it and there's like never anybody there. And like either it's like there's never anybody there, but it's like kind of nice and neat and there is food growing in there, or there's like never anybody there and it's just overgrown and nothing or whatever. So one of the things we were trying to do around all of the gardens that Lobelia did have, which like Tina said, were sort of, some of them are squatted gardens, some of them are more like permission from an owner, some of them are, you know, the owner is like part of Lobelia or something. And, you know, we had like 4 or 5 of them. And of course, a couple years later, like several of them have just been destroyed by developers and turned into, you know, little condos and horrible things like that. So there's a lot to be said for that and how successful we were or were not in terms of actually like taking space in the urban environment to grow food like in a consistent long-term way. But one thing that I think was really successful was like just using those gardens as a little jumping off point to like walk around the neighborhood and knock on all the doors and be like, hey, do you want a fig tree? We can plant it in your yard for you. And so, yeah, I think that's a lot of what the impetus behind Lobelia was, and the Almanac as well, is to kind of, you know, get away from some of these models that might have become a little stale or are a little captured or something maybe, and try to push for ways of doing these things and ways of thinking about food autonomy and community gardening that can be more transformative, hopefully. Yeah. And just as a little tangent, I use the word captured for the garden or whatever. That's like I'm drawing that from this book, Ramp Hollow, that talks about sort of the history of Appalachia and the sort of dispossession of people from an ecological base to turn them into workers, basically. And there's really interesting sort of like theoretical concept put forward in that of the captured garden, of this thing that was happening at a certain point in the coal town, like the company town era, where people are like living in some company town where they're just paid in scrip and they go to the store and buy with the company currency and all that kind of thing. And by this point of the level of dispossession they had gotten to, it was, instead of people having some, you know, garden in their home in the mountains that's like allowing them to maybe not have to go work in the coal mine all the time, at this era, people are expected to work their own garden inside the company town. And that was like the captured garden. It was owned by the company. And so it actually stopped being a form of subsistence that gave people more freedom and actually just turned it into a way for the company to spend even less money on the reproduction. And, you know, obviously there's a deep history of that with slavery in this country, and the ways in which the gardens that enslaved people had were to some extent serving that purpose of making it, you know, the slave owners have to spend less money on the reproduction, but then also there's these other liberatory hidden elements in there if people are able to grow the medicines they need and the the foods they need, and maybe be able to sell extra to gain some additional level of freedom or autonomy or something. And so I think that's something we really from the beginning have wanted to be thinking deeply about like how avoiding these pitfalls of like sort of a modern corollary to this, of ways in which the community garden down the street just fits seamlessly within the rest of the capitalist hellscape. And it's just a little thing to relax the workers in between their shifts, and it's not actually challenging power in some way. So we're really trying to think about ways to not become a captured garden or whatever.
To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod.